This last brief video segment will look at how opening up to trade or putting in place trade barriers affect a simple market. So if you look at the screen, the question is, why do people oppose trade? And the answer is because not everyone benefits. And as you learned from the previous video that I made, there's a lot of reasons why people oppose trade. There's a lot of impact on people domestically when foreign goods are imported, and there can be a lot of impact on consumers as well on households when jobs are removed to overseas. So this would be the sugar market in the United States, and we call this an autarky market if we assume a market that actually has no trade whatsoever. So you can see in the next slide this equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in the autarky market. So what I want you to look at is what happens actually when a world price like this price is imposed. So assume that the sugar market was at equilibrium, there was equilibrium price and quantity, that producers and consumers were both satisfied, there were plenty of jobs in the sugar industry, etc. And then the U.S. opens itself up completely to trade. This world price, this line down here, this one, is basically the price of sugar in the world market, in the global market. So it includes sugar being produced by places like Brazil and Costa Rica, Cuba, all kinds of countries that produce sugar. And what we're assuming here is that the world price is kind of like a perfect competition price, like we looked at in market structures. This price is established by global supply and demand, and it's lower than the domestic price because the United States doesn't actually have a comparative advantage in producing sugar. So what happens here? And that's really the key, is what happens when we open ourselves up to trade. So what happens is the consumers, if we look at where the demand curve intersects this world price, the consumers are able to buy a whole lot more sugar at this price, right? I'm going to draw a little arrow here. This would represent, oops, I should shift, there we go. This is this quantity right here, and I'm not going to type labels of quantity for everyone. This represents what consumers are now willing and able to buy at that world price. But the domestic producers, we can see where the domestic supply curve intersects with that price, they are not able to produce nearly as much. So this gap right here between the old equilibrium and the new equilibrium with world trade represents the loss of jobs, right? This is sugar that was being produced in the United States, and now we've lost those jobs. The total amount of imports is actually the distance between this point and this point, okay? So this right here represents imports. So this is what domestic consumers are buying, this is what domestic producers are supplying, and this is the quantity being imported. So the consumers are obviously much happier, and if you think about the area of consumer surplus, previously the area of consumer surplus would have been this triangle that I'm outlining. But now consumer surplus is this huge triangle, right? The consumers are feeling quite a bit of satisfaction. Producer surplus, however, is this triangle gets shrunk to this little tiny triangle down here. So domestic producers are quite angry and upset because people have lost jobs and they've lost profits. So the consumers are happy, but that is a very diffuse happiness, right? That any individual consumer doesn't feel it that much. They'll be happy because maybe they're paying $2 a pound for sugar instead of $3 a pound, but it's not enough. It's not life-changing. Whereas the people who lost their jobs in the sugar industry, they're feeling the pain pretty sharply. So what happens is the domestic producers tend to get together and lobby and call for trade barriers, right? Because they're very upset about this. So what happens then, if we have a tariff put in place, is that there's a new world price with tariff, and I'm going to represent that by this line. We'll make it blue if that works. Okay, and they lobby for a tariff, which then, oh, it didn't make it blue. Let me try this. Okay, now we have a little blue line there. So this blue line represents the world price with a tariff. So now, if you look at it, that the consumers are no longer able to buy this much, right? What they're able to buy is now this much. So the consumers have lost some of their surplus. They're paying higher prices. The producers, however, are able to charge higher prices because there's not as much of a threat of competition from that imported sugar anymore. So now the producers are able to produce more. They got back some of their market. Some of their jobs have been restored. So sort of a compromise between an autarky market that's completely closed and a free trade market that's completely open to trade. So we do lose some efficiency, right, because we have a portion that is no longer going to be supplied. And I'm not going to break that down for you here. It's a little bit complicated without being able to use markers and really dissect this graph. The effects of a quota are actually basically the same as the effects of a tariff. The only difference is that a tariff generates revenue for the government and a quota doesn't necessarily. So a quota, the line is going to look the same. The point is, rather than setting in place a particular price or a payment, we limit the amount. So rather than allowing them to import, let's say, 10,000 units, we reduce it to 6,000 units. And because there's less sugar being imported, the price naturally rises. Finally, let's look at the impact of a subsidy. And I'm going to erase the other lines here. Okay, so let's look at the impact of a subsidy. What a subsidy does is it helps the domestic producers compete with the foreign manufacturers. So it's a payment to the producers, and we're going to just draw a new supply line right here that represents the domestic supply curve with the subsidy in place. So this one's a little bit trickier to see. I'm going to go ahead and put these lines back on. If we had the free trade, we would have, this would be domestic consumption, and this would be domestic production, right? With the subsidy, with this new supply line, the consumers would still be able to buy this amount. Okay, this line would remain, so I'm going to make it blue. Make it a little bit, make it a little bit thicker too, so we can really see it. Okay, the consumers are still able to buy that amount. What changes is the amount that's being domestically produced. So domestic producers are no longer way over here. What happens is they get moved over here. So it cuts down on imports because the domestic producers are able to compete with the foreign producers. So you can see why domestic manufacturers or producers would want either a tariff, quota, or subsidy. One of the risks of allowing these is that sometimes these subsidies might go actually well beyond this point even, and in some cases, for example, in the sugar market and in the market for corn, we actually subsidize to the point that we actually lower the world price. And as a result, our prices are so low that it actually drives corn, cotton farmers, sugar producers, and others out of business in other countries. So it's very complicated to understand the whole analysis of trade restrictions. That is where we'll conclude that lesson. And the last thing that we'll do on November 7th is we'll talk about the second follow-up, which will be February 20th. So I'm proposing a few different topics. I do have some that we'll definitely do. For example, we will do currency markets and exchange rates, which are listed there. But I want to see if people are interested in doing a stock market lesson, looking at more personal finance topics, if there are other macroeconomic or international trade topics you're interested in. And then I want to remind everyone to bring at least one reflection paper with them, because we'll spend a little time looking at the reflection papers on February 20th. So make sure you check the Moodle site where I put the assignment so you know all of the pieces that are due for me. And James and Jamie will also include either questions in their video or a separate format for turning in questions for their sections for November 7th. Thank you very much. Sorry you couldn't be there.